I'm Jen Farrar. I predominantly teach plantID, mostly to beginners, but in the past I've taught to master's level. And apart from that, I make gardens and I go out and I do botanizing at 70 miles an hour going down the motorway, stuff like that. Not as a driver, of course. So for me, botanizing is looking at plants and figuring out what it is. I mean, pure botany is much more than that, of course, but yeah, I use the term botanizing for basically identifying plants. Mostly just, stuff that I already know, or I really like the fact that I can look at something and I know what family it is, but I might not know exactly what genus it is or what species it is. And that's kind of half the fun, because being able to start at family means I can then sort of progress much more quickly than having to start right at the beginning of, is it green? Is it woody? I think being able to identify plants is really important because for several reasons. One, because it's great fun. It gets you in the outdoors. It's something you can do by yourself or with other people. You can learn a lot about where you live by learning about the plants that you have growing around you. But also it means that there are more people monitoring the decline of the populations of plants in areas, or the encroachment of invasive species, so alien species coming from other countries, which might be problematic for either because of plant health issues or because they actually exclude a lot of the species that are special to that area. And what I mean by being able to notice, it means more people noticing changes in diversity, is of course with climate change we're seeing plants having to go to higher altitudes if they can. So a lot of plants are already in their sort of not in their sort of optimum habitats. And if they can't go any further, in terms of altitude, then a lot of them we're going to lose entirely. So it's really great when people are able, if they're hill walkers and they learn the stuff they're going to be walking past, and they start to notice changes. I mean, that gets fed back into the system, and we can start pushing for legislation to, sort of putting more pressure on people to actually change the way we do stuff whenever it comes to climate change and carbon dioxide release and stuff. I think in the past, certainly, the way that people learnt to identify plants was very much by rote, where they would be sat down with a book and they would have to start right at the beginning of the book going, is it green? Is it in water? Is it woody? All that kind of thing. Whereas the methodology we use for the summer school is actually teaching people to identify plant families based on their floral characters, and this year we've introduced a methodology for recognising vegetative characters as well. Because a lot of the time, whenever you find a plant, the flowers might have gone over or they might not be out yet. So if you're able to look at the vegetative characters, it'll give you and recognise those, or work through what those which families those characters might belong to. It gives you a huge head start whenever you're wanting to go on and look in a book. Or even if you're sort of wanting to, if you have an idea what genus it might be. So a lot of plant families are basically sort of big related groups, a bit like the great apes, for example, primates. Whereas a genus would be, for example, like everything within the Homo genus. So, Homo neanderthalis, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, us. So within a genera, we have different species, and often there are similarities within the genera. But whenever you have a family that has got similarities across the board for that family, then it actually is really useful to be able to understand those characteristics, identify them, and sort of slot them into the database you've got in your head and sort of see what comes out the other end. And a lot of the time it narrows it down to, maybe sometimes a single family and sometimes just a a small sort of only a few or a handful of families, which is much easier to work through and figure out what it is you got than it would be if you were having to start right at the beginning and work out whether you had an apple or a grass. I make gardens for friends and my friendly neighbours. And I tend to garden in a very naturalistic way myself. And by that I mean that things that are happy in my garden stay, of course. And some of them self-seed around the place, and I don't clear away sort of the winter debris, sort of the dead leaves and the dead stems until very late in spring, sort of early summer, because I want my garden to be full of invertebrates, pollinating invertebrates, beetles, all the other things that sort of enrich the soil and mean that my garden is a good place for foraging animals, like whether it's small rodents, birds, or otherwise. So whenever I'm creating a garden, I try and make sure that I put in plants that are happy where I'm putting them. So, I'm not going to put something that wants somewhere really dry and sunny in the sort of the coolest, darkest, shady, sort of slightly damp spot of the garden. And that's really important because then it'll be happy and it'll do well, and it could well sort of move itself around nicely. And having a huge diversity of different types of plants as well, where different flower forms, which are, some flower forms are better for pollinating flies and bees, or others are really good for butterflies or moths. And having a longevity throughout the season, right from as early in sort of spring stroke end of winter, right through to the other side of, if possible, all year round, having something in the garden that actually provides some nutriment to insects that might be flying. Because even during the winter, if it's a warm day, you will still get sort of small flies and things like that out and about. Maybe not bees, but you will definitely get, sort of small insects. And they are important because the rarities are fun, but actually the things that support the rarities are all the really common things that most people don't even think about or look at. So yeah, my ethos of gardening is very much trying to support try to give a supportive habitat to the things that I share that space with. I had the luck of growing up with parents who were both keen gardeners, and my mother also was the first National Nature Reserve warden for the National Trust in Northern Ireland. So I used to go out during the summer school holidays and sort of go along with her for whenever she was doing her wardening, and ask her lots of questions and pester her enough to the point where I would get monosyllabic answers for things. But I also learned a huge amount doing that, not just about plants, but about insects and birds and mammals and so on. Sort of the environment, ecological systems, the geomorphology of landscape, that sort of topography, reading the landscape effectively. And so for me, going into sort of environmental science, ecology kind of route for university was, something that, I thought was a really good fit for me. And in my second year of university, back in my 20s, I went on a plant science field trip up to Betty Hill on the north coast of Scotland, and just realised just how much I loved looking at plants and identifying them, and got quite competitive, which was quite funny because I'm not really a very competitive person a lot of the time. That was the thing that sparked the joy, but also made me realise how much I already knew. Because of course, whenever you're growing up doing stuff, you don't really realise that you're sort of you're a mini expert almost. Although I do remember we were having a quiz day at our primary school, and one of my question was, what eats sea lettuce? Which is mute swans. It was like, that was an incredibly nerdy question to ask of my peers who had no clue, of course. And that started off my my sort of interest in plants specifically. And I was doing environmental science with soil science, and I got really into the why plants grow in certain places, especially the specialist plants, of course, and why some plants are generalist, some plants are specialist, and also how the environment a plant actually grows in affects how it grows. So you have this fantastic thing called phenotypic plasticity, where a plant, for example, if there was a plant growing in the grass here, it would be, because it's being mown regularly, it would be really low to the ground. Its flowers would be just above the level of the grass. But if it was allowed to grow in the garden setting in the bed, it would be 2-3 foot tall, and the leaves would be much bigger. But the flowers would be the same size, but the leaves would be much bigger. Exactly the same species, quite possibly related, possibly even the same parentage. But because of where they're growing and the sort of situation and the pressures on it in that position, you get these two very different growth forms. And as my academic career progressed, certainly the second time I went to university, that was something that became really fascinating to me. And that evolved into, quite literally, the evolution of plants. What the pressures that have driven the evolution of plants, partly, of course, due to the pollinator syndrome and the co-evolution with insects, but also just all those funky chance happenings that allowed things to move from the water onto the land, and then from being sort of a film on the land to having actual structure, and then having structure but then producing things which carry nutrients and water into the leaf, so the leaf was able to get bigger and more and stronger, and then suddenly that sort of very simple vascular system was able to start branching. So you went from tiny little leaves on a huge plant, admittedly, into huge leaves on a smaller plant. And then that progressively, of course, started to work its way into then conifers. So you start getting fruit on the plant rather than sort of lots of spores travelling through the air as you do with mosses and ferns, to the development of actual flowers, that caused this mass diversification of the flowering plants, which coincided with the emergence of pollinating beetles. And ever since that point of, there's been a huge co-evolution of both flowering plants and insects, with things like the daisy family and the carrot family having lots of tiny flowers, all groups really sort of strongly together, mostly pollinated by things like flies, which are the most derived insect as well. So yeah, that just sort of excites me hugely, and I love being able to pass that information on. And a lot of that excitement I have about that stuff, being able to show that to people, and especially if we can see insects actually sitting on plants, I can sort of put in that little bit of a juicy sort of factoid in there as well. And it just excites people, sort of like, oh wow, that's cool, sort of, well, that's awesome, or wow, that's so cool, look at that. Oh. When a bumblebee goes in a pea, or sort of pea flower or something like that, and the little sort of pollen, little stigma comes up and pokes it in the bum and collects some pollen and disappears again. It's just stuff like that. It's just so cool and fun. And it's just wonderful to see people's faces whenever they sort of, I capture their imagination just by showing them something really simple.